Good evening and thanks for staying tuned. Welcome to the very last segments of this 50 years after Biafra, the story of healing, reconciliation and reintegration. My name is Ladi Akeredoluale, and tonight we are having a panel discussion about all that has transpired this week and all that has been said about the lessons and the history and going forward from the tragic events of 1967 to 1970. All through the week, we've been talking to different people, we've been taking different reports, different perspectives, revisiting history, and taking a look at some of the lessons that can be drawn from there with a view to taking the nation forward on those three central themes of healing, reconciliation, and reintegration. And tonight will be no exception. I have a star-studded panel, if you like, joining me on the program tonight. Starting, of course, from the far left there is Professor Pat Utomi. Now, for those who know Professor Utomi is the Chief Executive Officer and founder at the Center for Values in Leadership. He was also the founding senior faculty of the Lagos Business School, stroke the Pan-African University. He's a professor of political economy and is a former presidential candidate. Professor Utomi, thank you for joining us.
I'm glad I could.
Now, sitting next to him is Major General Obi Umahi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ladi.
General Umahi was the former GOC of the 81 Division of the Nigerian Army, amongst other command and staff positions that he held during a more than 2-decade-old career in the Nigerian Army. And of course, sitting next to me here is Mr. Charles Nwodo, who is the founder of Center for Entrepreneurship Knowledge Exchange. Thank you so much for being with us. Mr. Nwodo is, of course, Executive Chairman of the Excel Africa Group and is the President of the Nsukka Professionals Association. Thank you so much for joining us. We're also hoping that in the course of the program, we'll be joined by yet another guest, but for now, I'll keep that a secret. We'll go on with the discussions we have. Let me start off with General Umahi. You were in the Army. And when we talk about events like this, quite a lot of people talk about it from the outside looking in. But those who actually did the fighting have a somewhat different perspective of this. Now, without going back into the history of it, what do you think were the key lessons that soldiers took away from this?
Well, every soldier understands that war is the worst thing that could happen to any society, because the life of a soldier could go in first normally. So as much as possible, soldiers are peacemakers. They try to negotiate through any terrain of crisis to establish the possible lanes of towing the line of peace rather than war. So the kind of fatalities that took place during the Civil War, I do not think that any person can wish it for his own enemies. So from the soldier's point of view, it's the worst thing that could happen when you are marching on top of your brothers, on top of dead bodies, as you advance through an operation. I think it's the most terrible thing emotionally that could happen to any soldier who has conscience. I think for a soldier, war should be the last option.
Now, Mr. Nwodo, that's the soldier's perspective. Now, when you come to 50 years afterwards, now, depending on who you talk to, 50 years is a long time, but at the same time, it's not such a long time. Would you say that that time was enough for us to take the lessons from the event, including the ones that General Umahi has talked about, and apply them in the everyday life and growth process of the country towards development?
Thank you very much, Ladi. The straight answer is it's not about the time, the length of time. I think we just haven't, as a nation, been able to do what we need to do. In other words, we have failed to learn the lessons that a war, any war, as bad as and as unfortunate as it was, ought to teach us as a nation. The first is to confront our reality. What is the reality? We fought a war. Why can't we just say we fought a war and deal with the facts of that war? Why did we fight the war? Who lost what? What was destroyed? What is the extent of destruction? What is the extent of reconstruction that was required? And so on and so forth. Today, we call it Armed Forces Remembrance Day. It's a vague nomenclature, if you like. We should be able to say, yes, the Europeans had the invasion of Normandy. They called it the war. We had Second World War. The Americans had the Civil War. After that, then the healing can start. Because if you live in denial, you won't be able to confront the ghosts, which is what we are dealing with. And I think part of what we need to do as a nation is to call a spade a spade. We fought a war. And that's why the issue of reconciliatory arts appear to sound hollow, because we haven't done the things that ought to have emanated from that lesson. For example, after the Civil War, the Americans implemented some changes to their constitution. That's why you had the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment to their constitution. If you look at Nigeria, we haven't done anything in the aftermath of the war to substantially and fundamentally alter the governance structure. That was part of the problem that created the war in the first place. Nothing. We're just papering over the issues, hoping that somehow things will sort out themselves. Even the reconstruction, rehabilitation, and reintegration that was proclaimed didn't have the force of law. And the Constitution that was promulgated the next time, in the 1979 Constitution, that was supposed to have been informed by the lessons of the war, were truncated by the military coup that essentially suspended it and came up with another unitary constitution that took us back to the same pre-1967 situation, essentially, by creating unitary structures, congesting the federal system with the exclusive legislative list and so on and so forth. So, as a nation, if you step back, we haven't really learned anything. We don't seem to have taken the pains to actually interrogate the war, the causes, and then that's why we haven't been able to heal completely. You know, they still have the scars, you still have the issues around the war, still 50 years after, and that's a sad commentary.
Well, we're going to take an insert from someone who knows about this war, who fought in this war, and who talks about unity. But while we're waiting for that, let me ask Professor Tommy, coming from what both General Mahi and Mr. Nwodo have said, at the stage at which we are now, so many people have talked about moving forward, the need to take the lessons and push. I know I had asked you at on a different platform about this, and I want to ask again, given some more of the knowledge that has been brought to bear on this conversation since this anniversary started on Sunday. If those lessons have not been taken, and as a result, our growth is either slowed down or stopped, how do you go beyond that? Because in a country where you have 300, 400, 500 ethnic groups, possibly as many languages, where do you begin with this kind of process?
Well, you begin really with education. As a teacher of business, I sometimes say to people that the greatest learning is from experience. I talk about an ROE, a return on experience. And the point that both of them have made is that we have not gotten that return on experience. It means that we are way down the learning curve. And when you have a company, I use the metaphor of business, you have a company and people are not learning, it means that you're going to have reworks. That is, you goes into the pin shop, and because you haven't learned that this was what caused the problem, you spray the car again. And you're going to keep spending more money respraying cars. But the person or the organization has gone through that learning curve, that's way higher on the learning curve, will have a lower cost structure and therefore will respond more quickly to challenges coming from the environment and will be able to be more effective in meeting their goals. So what we must begin to do is educate ourselves, educate each other. And I think that the fantastic thing that Channel Television has done this week is provide a platform for that learning. And I have gotten incredible positive feedback from the fact of this. Because there are many people who just lived around myths about this civil war and really never understood some of the things that happened until this week's conversation. And so I think we must continue this process and help people learn and get a return on that experience in a way that will facilitate growth. Take a very, very simple example of economic life in Nigeria. There is a tendency for us to make a mistake in Nigeria to think that revenues that you can extract from the system is what makes you rich, makes you more successful. So Nigeria spends so much time, takes so much trouble struggling over revenues. What share of revenue? No, derivation, 125%, 113%. It is easy to show very clearly that most people who have gotten more revenue have become poorer. Just because they have not understood what really leads to growth and a better quality of life. So we're all focused on how can we share, and these things cause unnecessary aggro. People are fighting for something that's making them poorer. But if they had enough knowledge and realized that those things don't make them grow, perhaps they could have a better conversation around, say, the structure of a federation, rather than, are they getting more revenue than I am getting, which really is irrelevant to a better quality of life in the final analysis. All it does when you have this extra percentage revenue is that some elites in your place gather around, get a little more money, buy some houses in London, and in fact, it prevents you from being creative about how you produce, and so you actually get much, much poorer. So,
Prof, let me put you on pause there. I was talking about someone who had fought in this war on the Nigerian side. 15 years after the war ended, he went on to become the head of state of Nigeria. And so I want to have us listen to General Ibrahim Babangida talk about national unity.
The unity of Nigeria, as far as we are concerned, was an article of faith amongst my generation. Nobody would like to see this country going through another civil war. Nobody would like to see this country disintegrated, because we would be unfair to those who put their lives on the line and died for the purposes of keeping the country one. If we let it go, we will not be fair to them. Millions of thousands of people were killed, a lot were maimed, some were permanently disabled, and so on. So we shall not be fair to those people who laid their lives for the sake of this country, to get the country. That's why we have that belief. We are very passionate about it. We have done reasonably very well indeed, because by about the war was finished in 70, and the first, we had military governments, then civilian governments immediately after the war. The military government from 1970 up till about from 1966 to 1975, and then another military government from 1975 to 1980 or thereabout. 79. And then a civilian administration, 79 to 83. then military from 83 to 84, then another military 84 to 93, and now we succeeded in keeping the civilian administration in place. This is all thanks to the military for its determination to install a democratically elected government in the country.
Well, there you have General Babangida talking first about national unity and then the role of the military in keeping the country united. Let me come back to General Mahi now. And he talks about the role of the military. What we didn't take in that interview was where he talked about the military. If the military is united, then an example is set for the rest of the country to be united. Okay, is that really true?
I think it's absolutely right. Because the military is a microcosm of the nation. If there is unity of purpose in the military, if the military is truly united in the love of this nation, I think it will become very obvious to the political leadership. And they will be careful about how they carry on the governance of the nation, knowing that the military will not tolerate rascality. It will have helped us. But the truth is that the military is just a reflection of what is happening in the civil world, in the civil sector. The civilians sometimes, they even relate a lot better, but people outside do not know it. In terms of promotion, you see a reflection of nepotism, tribalism. In terms of posting, you see that also reflected. But because the military runs a strict hierarchy of command with a stiff regime of sanction against any indiscipline, so everybody keeps quiet. But the truth is not that everybody is in agreement with what is happening.
At that point, let me put you on pause, General, and use the opportunity to welcome from our studios, or rather from Abuja. Joining us on this special day is Dr. Chris Wabeze Ngige, Minister of Labor and Productivity. Dr. Ngige, thank you for joining us. Welcome to this special panel. Let me throw you in at the deep end. I doubt that you have been able to follow the discussion so far, but let me start by asking you, do you think that governments down the years have tried to carry on with this policy of healing, reconciliation, and reintegration that was started in 1970? All right, we seem to be having some difficulty with Dr. Ngige's connection there. We'll take a break, and then when we come back, we'll continue the discussion. So please stay on with us on this special evening.
Aba in Abia State, popularly known as the Eyimba City, became a target for the Nigerian troop. It was a base to be captured before heading to Umahia, which became the headquarters of the Biafran military after the fall of Enugu. This building became a temporal abode for the Nigerian troops during the war, while the owners fled for safety. Mrs. Agnes Cheta, who says the family returned home after the war, narrates what she knows.
Mgbe mbụ ha tosiri bomb nke mbụ ha tọrọ I was standing in front of this building when the soldiers threw bombs, which killed a man on his bicycle. I am begging that what happened then should not be repeated.
Another site worthy of mention is the Ojuku bunker. It was the headquarters of the Biafran military and served as a hideout and an escape route during attacks. The bunker is some 9 feet underground. We visited the home of retired Colonel Emeka Ananaba, a war veteran who says the Civil War was an experience, but wondered if the country has yet learned the lessons inherent.
We should have learned our lessons, but we are not learning our lessons because we are not telling ourselves the truth. Yeah, that's what I want to say. It depends on how you feel and the leadership of a people feel about it. It depends on conception.
In the dead of the night, we catch up with Sasa Ngukwe, nicknamed Corporal Nwafo, who was on the front line of the battle. He warns against a repeat of such experience in Nigeria.
Each time you fire a shot, chances are you're going to hit somebody. And so, what is the big idea? You look at the man you kill, he's just like you. So why all this bloodletting? It doesn't make sense to me. I wish we could make a U-turn.
While the war may have ended, the memories still linger, and these structures will serve as a reminder that dialogue is always the best option.
That report from Abba highlighting some of the landmarks and some of what happened. As you heard, the troops, the Biafran troops, withdrew to Abba at some point after Enugu had fallen on the way to Umuahia, and all the landmarks that are there. Among other landmarks that were there that are in that area is the National War Museum, and it is that I want to come to you, Mr. Wodo, to talk about. The National War Museum highlights the fact that there was quite a large amount of technological development, some born out of sheer necessity during the period, weapons, refineries for production of fuel and all of that. But it doesn't appear as if we built on those afterwards. Dr. Ngige was talking about the plan being truncated after 1975, that there was a plan, but that the coup which removed General Gawan truncated the 3R program. If we take that as correct, this aspect of it was also affected, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, certainly, and which is part of the reason we at Ndibo Lagos, my President General here, we are out on the waves, on the road, trying to expand the communication space and create awareness for this civil war. The reality is that for some strange reason, administration after administration appears to have treated the Civil War as some sort of secret, national secret. You didn't want to talk about it, otherwise you'd be labeled one thing or the other. If you were on one side, you were this. If you were on the other side, you were on that. But war is war. Look, it happened even for Christians. There was war in the Old Testament. For Muslims, there was war. Muhammad himself was a warrior. So there's nothing wrong about fighting a war. And we should be able to come out openly and talk about the war. That's the only way we can distill the elements and control the narrative. We can frame the narrative about the history of the war to suit our purposes, including national development, which is one of the things you are talking about. How did the Biafrans, how did they survive? What kind of ingenuity, enabled them to survive for so long against the blockade by the federal forces and so on and so forth? what kind of environment gave rise to that kind of creativity, and who were these people who were responsible for that creativity? That's what other countries did. The industrialization of the United States benefited tremendously from the Second World War elements. You know, they even had to import some people from the German side, you know, and so on and so forth. But we haven't been able to do this. And that's, again, because we appear to be living in some kind of denial. And there are even some positive stories. There are heroic stories that we can learn. There are people on both sides who were responsible for rescuing, daring rescues of supposed enemies that we can transform into folklores that will create the bond of unity to show that, look, this war wasn't just about hatred and mistrust. There are some people really across the divide who were working hard to bridge this same violence, make sure that the war the destruction, was reduced to the barest minimum, and showed love even in the middle of that whole conflict. Those are the kind of things we can isolate and produce them in a way that use them to frame the national narrative that suits the urgent need for unity, for inter-ethnic harmony, for national development. But by continuing to just paper over the issue, problems don't solve themselves. Somebody has to step up and solve the problem. And we hope that by at least creating this kind of awareness, that we can initiate the conversation. At least those of us who still believe very much in the Nigeria concept. Oftentimes you hear people like the General Babangida say the unity of Nigeria is non-negotiable, and I laugh. This kind of sentiment, I know where he's coming from, because these are people who laid their lives, to fight for unity. But for our own children, this kind of sentiment doesn't hold water. You have to prove it. Nigeria has to mean something for them. And that's why this kind of conversation has to be urgent, because our own generation is the bridge between the Babangida generation and this new globalist focused generation that don't even care. They don't know about the Civil War. So they are looking at the elements, the realities of their circumstances. If you tell them Nigeria is their country, they say, what has Nigeria done for me?
At that point, let me put you on pause, Mr. Wodo, and someone who definitely knows about these 3 R's and what they were meant to achieve and what they were about was Chief Philip Asiodu, who was then, at the height of all of these events, a permanent secretary, one of those referred to as super permanent secretaries, one of the topmost advisors to the then head of state, General Yakubu Gowon. Here he is talking about the 3 R's program.
During the Civil War, we were able, I and a few of us, we did quite a bit of helping in presenting what were federal government hopes post-Civil War about what became 3 R's: rehabilitation, reconciliation, reconstruction. Now, in 1969, while the war, we saw it was coming to an end, we were able to organize a conference in Ibadan with Chief Simeon Adebo, our permanent representative in the UN, as the chairman. We had the academia, politicians, students, journalists, to talk about what Nigeria should do after the war. And it was the conclusions of that conference, and it was produced in a book edited by late Professor Nitiri and late Alice Nayeda, that led us to do the 70-74 plan and also 75-80 plan. The first thing is rehabilitation. Feed people, get them together. No question of repetition of massacre or killings or somebody is Biafran, because war has ended. No victor, no vanquished. And that was going on. And reconstruction. Materials were given to enable people build back their shacks. But quite interestingly, in places like Lagos, even the people who had properties and gone away, rents were collected, kept intact. When they came back, they were given. Badiwe and Co. and others. It's only in Port Harcourt, unfortunately, that they did these abandoned properties and took over people's properties. And you know, the Igbos had developed much of Port Harcourt. That was very, very unfortunate. And we must praise the Igbo man for his courage and resilience. In no time at all, despite the pogroms and all that, they were back in many of these cities, you know. And today, despite what we are hearing about hip-hop and mass-up and all that, outside the big companies and conglomerates, when you look at the second tier of activity, traders, businessmen, the Igbos are in every state.
All right, Chief Philip Asedu talking about the 3 hours program. And Prof, I want to start off from where the last statement that Chief Asedu made, which was that in no time at all, in spite of all the disadvantages and so on, the Igbos were everywhere, 4 or 5 years afterwards. But then the point about the National Development Plan, 70 to 74, 75 to 80, ties in with what Dr. Ngige, who we're expecting to join us at any point, talked about it being truncated by the events of 75, which then meant that the new administration that came in 75 had other priorities, so to speak. Should we simply go back to that?
Well, first of all, the whole idea of national planning, which we kind of lost, is critical. Anybody who wants to get anywhere sits down and asks, where is it I'm going to? I think that why national planning has not worked or been working in Nigeria in recent, it's a function of a number of things. Like with most Nigerian things, leadership failure. We've not seen people show leadership in that. A leader is someone who sees tomorrow today and develops a roadmap to that tomorrow that he has seen today. We're not seeing much leadership in our country at many levels today. And we need to begin to train leaders. And that's part of what I spend a great deal of my own time trying to do, because I see that people don't understand what it means to lead. It's sacrificial giving of self for the advance of the common good of all. There's too much narcissism, too much self-love, and that's taken away from leadership. So leadership is a critical part of it. The second is that we had this misfortune of oil in many ways. Oil was a good source of savings, if you want to call it that, that we could then invest to develop. But we did not respond cleverly to the gifting of oil as, say, our friends from Botswana responded to the gifting of diamonds, or the Norwegians with oil too, and all of that. So we went, oil drunk. And oil got in the way of thinking. And because oil got in the way of thinking, instead of then looking at where we're taking our country, we're consumed by what part of it am I getting and how am I showing that I have happened as a result of this oil. Planning took us very far. I like to, once I engaged Chief John Oyegun, who was in planning at that time, was one of the bright young permanent secretaries in planning, officials that became permanent secretary later. And I said to him, look at this power mess in this country. This is what you all did about planning for power. And then he said, yes. And then he took over the story because he was there. And he started, by now, if what Chief Oyegun and his colleagues were doing in planning when Chief Asiodu and co. were permanent secretaries had just been carried on, Nigeria would be at over 100,000 megawatts of power running seamlessly today. But that was further then compounded with the structural logjam that oil led us into. We're spending really beyond our means. When oil prices collapsed, because oil prices went up dramatically following the Iranian Revolution. In 1979-80, oil prices actually went to 40 barrels. At the time, unthought of. It was considered $40. In fact, both Time and Newsweek had a cover story, same words, same week, the world over a barrel. That was when oil hit $40. So the fact of all of that led us to spending like we were drunk, and then suddenly oil prices crashed, and we could not pay our bills. And we got into a structural logjam. To get out of it, we needed help. That help came in the form of what we have come to know as the Structural Adjustment Program. The Structural Adjustment Program forced us into a regime at the time in Washington called the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus set of policies that had been agreed to, and part of what the Washington Consensus did is give a bad name to planning. Because the Soviet Union central planning was receiving, and it was being bashed, which is true, the nature of planning in the Soviet-type system did not quite do what it was supposed to do. So central planning, getting a bad name meant planning was bad. And we abandoned the concept of planning completely. Whereas private corporations, the big companies, had to plan to get where they were going. The fact that planning was given a bad name meant that Washington told us planning was bad. We abandoned planning. Until KIK, Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu, was Minister of Finance and Economic Planning and tried to return to a regime in which we could do a perspective plan. So 30 years from now, what sectors do we want to dominate? Play very stoutly. And then you have a medium term, your budget rolls into all of those going forward. The discipline of that was lost in our country. And because it was lost, we couldn't follow up on what they thought true when the war ended. Planning more or less died around 1980-something. KIK's attempt to rustle it back didn't quite gain traction. And the development process in Nigeria has suffered from that failing.
Now, again, we're going to take a listen to one of the war commanders this time, one of those who commanded divisions during the Nigerian Civil War, talking about Major General IBM Haruna, Ibrahim Haruna. Here he is talking about the role of youth in nation building. Professor Otomi and General Mahi and even Mr. Nwodo have talked about the gap that exists between the generation that fought the war, their generation, and the much younger generation now. Here's General Haruna's view.
Human beings associate to survive and to keep peace and security by give and take. But when ambition now motivates and engineers the trail of association, then you have the desire to be foremost, to be oppressive, to be dominant, to be dictatorial. And it's ambition that makes people think that they can solve the problem that God himself has set for people to understand and live in peace. When I say that, is that, as I said, nature has been created with diversity, with conflicts, with disagreements. No society, no family would live without now and again some disagreement, some perceptions of change of family values or social values. So they are bound to be conflict. But the ambitious ones think that they can impose a solution, part of which will be disassociate with others or annihilate others or forcibly impose on others. And when people are so ambitious, they don't enter into discuss. They don't enter into search for some peaceful solution or even give time. Sometimes time solves problems. They are so anxious. They have the anxiety. They want what should be solved now should have been solved yesterday. And they think they are the Messiah. And they want to be messiahs also in the process.
Major General IBM Haruna there. Some of what he said is a bit confusing and controversial, but when we return from the break, we'll take a look at that, especially what he mentioned about what certain characteristics do to people that makes them react in particular ways. But for now, we'll take a very short break. When we come back from there, the discussion continues. And of course, we hope that we will now be joined by Dr. Ngige from Abuja. Please stay on with us.
The National War Museum sits on a landmass of about 3,700 square meters and located in Ebite Amafo community in Umuahia North local government area of Abia State. It houses the famous shortwave radio transmission of the defunct voice of Biafra.
On the right side and on the left.
The curator, Mercy Aduaka, says the museum has 3 galleries that covers traditional warfare during the pre-colonial and colonial era, the armed forces, and the Nigerian Civil War weapon galleries. This is the bunker that houses the defunct voice of Biafra shortwave radio transmission. We move down the almost 30-feet bunker. Pictures of protagonists of the war flood the staircase.
So Enugu has to fell because of their profuse bombing.
It's a hideout where where Biafran stays. Because that time this place was a jungle. Nobody knows that something of this nature was located here. It's a hideout. It also has a trench that connects them from here to Ojuku bunker. Soldiers communicate from here to the Ojuku bunker.
On display are obsolete military weapons and artifacts, which include the Biafran armored cars, also known as Red Devil, MF-19B small bomber aircraft, anti-aircraft gun launcher, Squid Mortar Mk4 anti-submarine gun, a Nigerian Navy ship used during the war, torpedoes, and the famous Ogbunigwe launcher, amongst others.
We are actually calling on government, even though we are government, so public servants under the government, to really step up their awareness creation, their running costs release, their empowerment packages financially.
For some of us who didn't witness the Civil War, for the fact that we were not born at that time, the stories we read may not be fully appreciated without visiting the National War Museum here in Umuahia. The National War Museum is a major tourist attraction in the state, as visitors of all class visit between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m.
Look at the devastating effect.
Museum officials are more concerned about giving a facelift to the facility with a high economic value. Chief Emmanuel Iwanyan is a war veteran. The elder statesman tells us that most of the war weapons used by the defunct Biafra during the Civil War were manufactured by the soldiers themselves, including himself.
Biafra was blockaded by land and sea. So Biafra had no choice but to produce these arms here.
He warns an attempt by any group of persons to return to the bloody path he once witnessed.
I think really that the best option and the best choice for Nigerians is for us to live together, for us to determine to live together and to abhor and avoid all these things that will create problem among us.
what we were talking about just before the break, the Biafra War Museum. There you saw some of the weaponry manufactured by troops of the then Biafran army themselves. One wonders why that was not taken any further. Well, maybe now I think we can go to Abuja and rejoin Dr. Chris Ngige, the Minister of Labor and Productivity. Now, Dr. Ngige, we've had difficulty establishing contact with you, but I hope you can hear me now clearly and that we can hear you as well. I wanted to ask you straight away, what is government doing now in the Southeast? Because one of the things that has run through most of the conversations today is that the Southeast has been virtually abandoned by the central or federal government to its own devices, roads, infrastructure, and all of that. What is the federal government doing? And if it's been abandoned, why? Why has it been abandoned? Okay, as I surmised, Dr. Ngige, we're still having difficulty with Dr. Ngige's audio. We'll see if we can rectify that before the program is over. But then that brings me back to the studio. General Mahi, moving forward now, because we're now in the last lap of this discussion. Moving forward now, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to ask Mr. Nwodo, and I'm going to have Prof. Each of you to give me two things that the government today, whether it's the federal or the state governments, must do to enhance this process of healing, national reconciliation and integration. Or if they're already doing them, what they can do to enhance them further. Let me start with you, General.
Yes, I think we must look at what costs the Civil War, the remote causes and the immediate causes that led to the Civil War. Then from there, you can understand what the government is not doing that it ought to do, or what it is doing that it ought to do better. I think that the most glaring problem in this nation that led to the Civil War is ethnic jingoism and religious conflicts. And that was what gave birth to suspicion and hatred. And the hatred has run so deep that, truth be told, Igbos seem to be over-stigmatized. Igbos are marked for maybe elimination or paralysis in such a way that Igbos should not be heard of in this nation. And I think until that mentality is checkmated, until that mentality is brought to an end and replaced with mutual love, Nigeria is not going anywhere. And secondly, you see, when you hate, it has a way of boomeranging. It is a boomerang that a nation will fight a war, and there were so many military scientific inventions. And because hatred had covered the faces of those who ought to turn around all those inventions, they rather jailed those who were responsible for all those inventions, rather than turning Nigeria to a Silicon Valley through the ingenuities of those people responsible for all those inventions. I think, like I said, one, our attitude, leadership, governance must change. Number two, the government must begin to see that Government is about finding out the potentialities in various parts of the country and trying to develop them in the interest of the totality, development, and progress of a nation. But where governors or government comes at the center, and they think, well, it's our time. It's the time of our ethnic group. It's the time of our religious group. Nigeria cannot move forward because it robs us of strategic planning and making use of all that is available in various parts of the nation.
General, let me put you on pause there. Mr. Nwodo, I've asked Prof this, so I'm not going to ask him again. I'm going to ask you now. There are people who talk about, at a personal level, that many Nigerians, whether they were in the East or they are not, have moved on. Intermarriages, movement. Prof mentioned the fact that, there's no part of the country now where you don't find Easterners, and even Chief Afsodu did the same thing. How many years afterwards? Until today, that still holds true. So if people have moved on in that way, why is what the General has just pointed out still so important?
Thank you very much. Like I said, problems don't solve themselves. People have got to solve problems. The Civil War arose because there were problems. Even if you do nothing, for the next 200 years, those problems will most likely become even more complex. And so that people have moved on is not because the problems don't exist. People have moved on because they just have to move on. Some of us are recognizing this challenge as a constraint to national development, and that's why we're talking. I personally have businesses that operate in the 36 states. Most of them are in the north. So I should know. I am a concerned Nigerian. That's why I'm speaking out. I'm not just speaking out because I am an Igbo man. I'm also speaking out because I see that if these problems are left unaddressed, it will affect the stability, the prosperity of future generation of Nigerians. So people have moved on. But I can also say that a little bit of the lessons have been, we can see some of the lessons. For example, what is going on in the Northeast. The government has set up a Northeast Development Commission. It's laudable because a lot of Nigerians have no direct feeling of the kind of devastation that is happening in the Northeast. Those of us who witnessed Biafra know exactly what those children are going through. We can relate with the suffering of the widows, the orphans, and so on and so forth. So that shows that something is possible. What we are saying is, let us take this step forward as a nation. There's still a lot that can be done, because if you go to the Northeast, most of the people showing concern are foreigners. Where are the rest of Nigerians? We all should rise in unison to support those brothers and sisters in the Northeast that are facing this kind of devastation. It is that kind of national momentum that is lacking. And that's what we challenge our leaders to do. And if we do that, because injustice to one is injustice to all. If one part of Nigeria is complaining, then Nigeria itself cannot be at peace. If the Igbos have a problem,
I have to put you on pause there because of our time.
Sure.
Prof, you're going to have the last shot at this. What do we do? What's to be done now?
A number of things that can be done to help things. First of all, we have to change the mindset. The southeast of Nigeria still feels like an occupied territory. You go in the roads, the police are every 50 feet, extorting money from the people, making life unbearable, and it seems to be a legacy of that war. That kind of thing must stop. Second, you've got to have a development strategy that sees the endowment of every part of the country, build global value chains of the endowments of every part. There's no part of Nigeria that cannot compete globally and make our country a rich country. But we're not applying ourselves. Thirdly, public choice. The people who make decisions should get off their head. Oh, these people, that people. What is the best possibilities from every part of Nigeria? That's when the momentum will really drive us all into prosperity as a country. But the institutions of state have to reflect the fact that every Nigerian can contribute and make a difference. Until people feel that the opportunities are open to them, until they feel that there is a just society, we're going to have a challenge making progress. You cannot talk peace without talking justice. It's a misnomer. So you've got to have a mindset of justice. When you have that mindset of justice, I give an example of myself.
Prof, I understand that we're going to give Dr. Ngige one more try.
Okay.
If Dr. Ngige can hear us, the question I still have for you, Dr. Ngige, is what is the government doing in the Southeast to make that region feel part of the rest of the country?
Well, I've earlier said that in terms of infrastructural development, this government has been very fair to the people of the Southeast in terms of infrastructural development, not in terms of their roads, not in terms of their airports, not in terms of even the new railways that are being planned for the country, the coastal rail. This government, even though the plan for the coastal rails have been there, we have amended the plan for the Southeast to benefit from it. That was a coastal rail plan that was designed by the Jonathan administration. So these governments have done what they should do. The road constructions that were abandoned in the Southeast, Enugu, Onitsha, Enugu, Okigwe, Umuahia, Aba, Port Harcourt, Oba, Okigwe, between Anambra and Imo State, Owerri into Aba, and then to Port Harcourt, Owerri down to Umuahia, and of course the second Niger Bridge, which is one of the flagship projects that was designed for a people. Civilian administration in Nigeria. And even when people have gone there to say they were commissioning the construction, they did so in 2007, they did so in 2008 and 10 and 2011, all during the election. All the civilian administration from Obasanjo to Jonathan that have gone to commission that bridge, and yet no work was going on there. It is this particular administration that arranged and syndicated funds to make for that construction to start off immediately. And the work is 45% completion as we speak. Through sovereign wealth funds and other funds that have been organized by this administration. I mean, if you go there now, at least one lane is being completed by a railroad construction company, LCC. The Umuahia to Aba and Umuahia Okigwe to Enugu, Enugu Okigwe Umuahia. Today you can do from Enugu in Aba in 1.5 hours. It was a journey of 5 hours. Yes, we have civilian administration in which people of the Southeast say that beneficiated them because they got political appointments. Because they got political appointments of, according to them, DC offices. I don't know what they mean by DC. For me, this office is the office that comes to my place to do work for me. People say that, and for me, the best thing who do for me is the man I call my father. That's what he is doing. This administration has done much in terms of citing projects in the Southeast, in terms of even giving a review that will assist them. So there we go. Not in terms of power. All the power in the Southeast has been liberated today. It's only for Onitsha. Asaba into Onitsha. Onitsha into Oka. Into Umuahia. There are other things now, that's transmission line. Yes, 15 years of people giving you and our sons and daughters fight us in these positions, and we can't see anything. I don't want to ask people to go and ask them what they did in their position. But that is the truth of the matter. So for me, as I said this year, what I think the Igbos of Southeast Asia will do is to join the mainstream policy. They have to reach this. And for me also, the Igbo politicians, Igbo legislators, those in government and outside government, there is a constitution, a document produced by the late General in 1994-95 Constitutional Conference. Everybody should go and look at that document. If Nigeria is talking about the new constitution, if you're talking about the structuring of the federation, go and look at that constitution. By the time you finish reading that constitution, you need that constitution is a constitution that points into the direction of the three acts. Healing, which is called reconciliation, rehabilitation of the people, and then reconstruction. Apart from the Babangida's administration in the military, apart from General Babangida, no military administration did reconciliation or did rehabilitation or did even reconstruction. In terms of whether it is political or economic, if you listen to that information, you will know what I'm talking about. They designed a program that was put into a master plan. So that master plan that was completed in 1975, and it was a pity. That was the day back in the soul of Nigeria in terms of the administration and constitution of the Civil War. We can't heal it in one day. It's a gradual process. We are now in a political administration. Political administration means you do give and take. You do what's trading, and you listen to the other party. The social dialogue in political administration. So, singing or trumpeting, religiosity, drums of war again, after more than 50 years, I don't think that's our system. We have to be systematic about it. We have to go the way our family father, Dr. Namdashiwe, taught us to do. And that is dialogue. Belonging to mainstream and being in one Nigeria. I'm a Zikis, and I believe in that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Ngige. I want to thank you. Want to thank you very much for exercising patience, even though we had all the difficulties in establishing contact with you this evening in Abuja. I'm told that I have 30 seconds to give each of you to wind up. So let me start with you, Prof, since it was you I put on pause.
Okay. Well, 30 seconds is a long enough time. I very often talk about the fact that I can go into 30 different states in this country and have a friend close enough to be upset that I went to a hotel. And that, I think, is a statement about the possibilities of our country. The businesses that people do across boundaries, keep them and they keep going. But when it is convenient, politicians play the ethnic card and deepen wounds. We must create a culture that pushes back on politicians behaving that way. If everybody comes with clean hands to the table, there will be equity, there will be progress for all. We all lose when we don't cooperate for the common good of this country.
Mr. Wadi, your 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I believe the average Nigerian is a good person, whether in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west. The average Nigerian abhors injustice. We saw it play out during the June 12th annulment struggle. Everybody rose as one and condemned it. And that's how Olusegun Obasanjo became president and won across the country. So part of the challenge and part of what we are organizing ourselves to do is to be able to take our message away from the political outbursts, away from partisan optics to the people of Nigeria and say, look, there's injustice. The Igbos have suffered. The Igbos are suffering. And we believe that the average Nigerian, forget about the political leaders, they would key into this. They would understand. They will feel it. The Northerners will feel it. The Westerners will feel it. The Southerners will feel it. And we'll continue to do this. And we thank Channel Television for this opportunity to bring this message home. We'll continue to raise the decibel of this message until every part of Nigeria hears it. Because we believe that the message is
30
justified.
seconds are
Thank
up.
you very much.
General Mahi, you have the last 30 seconds.
Thank you very much.
And I'm going to keep you up to that 30
on
seconds.
a final note, I want to appreciate Channel Television for this opportunity. And I want to say that what Honorable Minister Ngige has done is to establish the fact that the Southeast has been neglected by subsequent governments, by virtually all the governments since the end of the Civil War. And that is why there is no federal presence in the entire Southeast. So, which means that to end the war actually, something has to happen in the reverse. The federal government has to show determined effort to do something in the Southeast. And I think I think the Honorable Minister did not, maybe he had been traveling through the Southeast with helicopter, not on the road.
All right, at that point that we're going to leave it. Let me, of course, thank our guests. Let me especially thank Dr. Ngige for his patience. We had some difficulty, and that's why the program was extended beyond the stipulated time, because we had quite a bit of difficulty in establishing contact with Dr. Ngige, but we thank him very much for eventually being able to join us tonight. And to my studio guests here, Mr. Nwodo, General Mahi, and of course, Prof. Utomi, thank you so much for making out the time on this day to be with us. We want to thank you so much for being with us. Of course, it's not over. For 50 years after the Civil War, we have a documentary that seeks to encapsulate virtually everything that we have tried to do during the course of this week. The documentary has the same title as everything we've done during the course of this week. That is Biafra, 50 years after. Healing, reconciliation, and reintegration. Please enjoy it, and good night.
At independence in 1960, the huge human and natural resources across the regions that made up Nigeria stood out as strength for an evolving country. But these were soon to be tested in what many now refer to as one of the bloodiest civil wars in history. January 15, 1966 comes a twist that upset the peace in the Nigerian military circle, with some young officers led by Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzogu, an Igbo officer from present-day Okpanam in Delta State, staging a coup d'etat against the then civilian government, killing dozens of people, including the Prime Minister of Nigeria, Tafawa Balewa, many senior politicians, senior army officers,